This is my presentation on protest movements, a contrast and comparison of three movements. Beginning with feminism, I decided to focus primarily on African American women in feminism, just because I feel like they have multiple layers to their struggles, making there lots of topics to discuss. A couple of struggles. The comparison to the average white family. A lot of African American women had an issue with this, thinking that, you know, they shouldn't have to conform to this, idea of a average white family. You know, should they exchange their ancient security for the white woman's familiar cocoon? Should they have to kind of forego everything that they've learned to have to kind of conform to this new idea of the average family? And there was also the comparison to the white women's beauty. Many African American women had to or felt like they should have to change the way they look to be more widely accepted. They found themselves bleaching their hair and wearing blonde wigs to try to, come close to the idea of white beauty. But, ultimately these bleaching creams and hair straighteners, they didn't work. Their skin was still black and it was, they still had their quote unquote kinky hair instead of straight. They were constantly being compared to this average white woman, and they were basically the antithesis of what was considered beautiful. And there was also the, you know, idea of not the idea, but the shocking low wage scale. So women were already making less than, the average male. Um, you know, Based on statistics, a white male was making on average $6,700. A non-white male is making $4,277, which is less anyways. But then you get to the female sector, white females are making $3,900 and then non-white females making $2,861. So not having to do anything with their skill level, but just because they're not white, they were automatically making 2,861 compared to 3,991. That's more than $1,000 difference just because they're not white. But then making it going to the main point of feminism, they're making significantly less than men are. So that was a huge struggle for African American women. Equality and how they, fought these difficult times. Um, they fought the marriage laws that were in place and they created their own movement. There were several other factors on how they fought for their change, but these are 2 points that I wanted to bring up specifically. As for the marriage laws, they are due for sweeping reform, and they wanted to go ahead and start from the beginning and wipe the existing ones off of the books. Um, they said that if there was special protection for working women, they don't know why it was needed. They don't need protection that men do not need. What they need are laws to protect working people, to guarantee them fair pay, safe working conditions, protection against sickness and layoffs, and provision for dignified, comfortable retirement. Men and women need these things equally. The idea that one sex needs protection more than the other is a male supremacist myth. And then, moving on to movements, there were many groups that were formed in order to kind of make this movement, give it momentum and get started. There was the idea that Black women in their respective movements had two choices. They could either remain in the movement and try to educate non-Black or non-female comrades about their needs, or they could form a movement. The first alternative, it wasn't very viable, so that leaves you the next option to form their own movement. It was kind of hard to get started though, because there were many myths that made Black women feel like they shouldn't be fighting for their own freedom. Among these are Black women thought that they were already liberated, that racism is the primary oppression Black women have to confront. Then there's feminism is nothing but man hating. Women issues are narrow, and that feminists are nothing but lesbians. The Black feminist movement was formed to address the way sexism, racism, and classism influenced the lives of Black women whose needs were ignored by the Black men. I'm going to be discussing LGBTQ movement. Going over their struggles. They, what I mean by saying group definition confusion, a lot of these people, a lot of gay Americans wanted to, fight for equality, but they didn't necessarily know how to organize themselves because they weren't necessarily a class or an ethnicity. They were more, it was a sexuality, and at the time, that wasn't really an option. So there was a little bit of confusion on really how they were defining themselves. And then moving on to really the struggles that they had to face, there was the exclusion from military and federal service. Um, there was, for a while, President Eisenhower signed a 1953 executive order that established sexual perversion as grounds for being fired from government jobs. They weren't allowed to, be in the military or even hold a federal position. And then that snowballed, once this law came into place, other employers followed. If they found out that you were, gay, it was grounds for termination. And then the sexual relations laws, which I just find completely insane, is that sex between consenting adults that were the same sex, even in their own private homes, could be punished to life in prison or confinement in a mental institution or even castration. It just seems so archaic to me, even for this time, but it was in fact an issue that they had to, face. And then they outlawed in all states except Illinois. Um, all of the states but Illinois, it was considered illegal or it was outlawed to be gay. And, you know, people were barred from illegally immigrating to the United States due to their psychopathic personality disorder. And Illinois was the only state where homosexuality was not explicitly outlawed. Go over how they fought for, their equality. Rights and organized groups. Again, several other ways that they did, but these are the two that I wanted to point out. Um, so with riots, um, there was definitely the Stonewall is the one that kind of comes out in everyone's brain. No other civil rights movement in America had such a kind of, I guess, snowball effect for this movement. Many gay people remained ignorant and until Stonewall, and when Stonewall happened, it kind of was just a funnel that made people decide to stand up and stand up for their rights. Then the organized groups, of course, there were tons of groups that formed. There was the Gay Liberation Front, just basically fighting for their rights and their issues because there are several different sectors of, the gay community, and people had to find which one fit them most. American rights. This one is very, we've talked about it a lot in class, so there's a lot to discuss. But my main struggles that I thought I would point out are equal employment, equal housing, equal education, and police brutality. These are all things that they had to fight for, which just seems so crazy on a slide to see, like, that these are problems that people in America still weren't getting. Police brutality and just getting education and equal housing is huge struggles that these people, their rights that they were not given. Moving on to their fight for equality and what they did to, earn these rights for themselves. Protests and organized groups. A big one that comes to mind is Rosa Parks. In Montgomery, Alabama, she refused to give up her seat to a white bus rider, kind of starting this big movement. Even though blacks were required to give seats towards the front of the buses to whites, she decided not to, and she was jailed, which started a black community boycott of the city's bus system. The boycott lasted for more than a year, which really demonstrated the unity and determination of black residents. And then organized groups, a big group that comes to mind is the Black Panthers. Their original purpose was to patrol African American neighborhoods to protect African American residents from acts of police brutality, but eventually, kind of snowballed into a revolutionary group that called for the arming of all African Americans. They also fought for the exemption of African Americans from the draft because they felt that, they had undergone enough and they didn't want to fight for a country that didn't, hold them to the same standards as their other Americans. They also fought for the release of all African Americans from jail and the payment of compensation to African Americans for centuries of exploitation by white Americans. Similar. Um, they all used protests to make a difference. They had protests that snowballed into movements, and they made huge strides in the 1960s. With the African Americans, with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, snowballed into a huge movement that created unity. With gay Americans, the Stonewall protest really was a mile marker for the movement. And then with feminism, there are so many different specific movements that can be used, such as sit-ins and bra burnings that really unified those movements. And then, of course, they all three made huge strides in the 1960s. So how are they different? Some fought for gender, some fought for race, and some fought for their sexuality. And then their specific wants varied greatly. There were different types of equality being fought for. Obviously, feminists were fighting for gender equality. African Americans were fighting for race equality, and gay Americans were fighting for sexuality equality. So all three very different, but you know, they still had wants that were similar, but their big specific aspects of what they wanted varied greatly. Whether it be employment opportunities, some were similar, but the specifics of their employments were different. Whether it be housing, whether it be, you know, being physically allowed to be who you are in the state that you live in. All very different, but in conclusion, you can see that there are similarities that will allow these Americans to kind of come together as one big group, which is how we are able to still discuss them. Thank you very much.